In the damp, shadowy halls of Kensington Palace, 1819, a child was born into a world of dynastic uncertainty. Princess Alexandrina Victoria, the daughter of the Duke of Kent, entered a lineage fractured by scandal and loss. Outside, the British Empire held its breath as the Georgian era waned. Inside, the flickering candlelight cast long, ominous shadows against the heavy velvet curtains. No one yet realized that this tiny infant, hidden away from the public eye, would eventually oversee an era that would redefine the global map and the very concept of monarchy. Victoria's childhood was far from the fairy tales often associated with royalty. Following the death of her father when she was just a baby, she was raised under the stifling Kensington system. Orchestrated by her mother and the ambitious Sir John Conroy, this regime was designed to keep her weak, isolated, and dependent. She was never allowed to be alone, sleeping in her mother's room every night and walking downstairs only while holding someone's hand. This environment of controlled silence and watchful eyes forged a steel within the young girl that her captors never anticipated. The power struggle between the Duchess of Kent and the young Victoria intensified as she grew older. Sir John Conroy, a man of shadows and manipulation, sought to be the power behind the throne, constantly pressuring the princess to sign documents that would grant him a regency. Victoria, however, possessed a quiet, stubborn defiance. She spent her hours studying history and languages, her only true companions being her dolls and her King Charles spaniel, Dash. In the flickering glow of a single candle, she wrote in her journals, documenting a life that felt more like a prison than a palace. June 20th, 1837. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and morning mist. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain arrived at Kensington to deliver news that would change history. King William IV was dead. Victoria, just 18 years old, was woken from her sleep and informed of her ascension. She met them in her dressing gown, her hair loose, appearing fragile yet remarkably composed. At that moment, the Kensington system collapsed. She requested her first act as queen. 1 hour of complete and utter solitude. The coronation at Westminster Abbey was a spectacle of gold and gloom. Amidst the heavy incense and the weight of tradition, the crown was placed upon the head of the girl queen. While the public cheered for a fresh start, the political landscape remained a minefield of seasoned men who doubted her ability to rule. She stood alone at the altar, a small figure draped in heavy robes of state, shouldering the burdens of a global empire. The ceremony was a transition from the old, corrupt world of her uncles to a new, uncertain Victorian age of morality and industry. Victoria's early reign was marked by her reliance on Lord Melbourne, the Prime Minister, who became a father figure and a political mentor. In the candlelit offices of Buckingham Palace, they discussed the nuances of governance and the shifting social tides of Britain. However, her stubbornness occasionally led to scandal, such as the bedchamber crisis, where her refusal to change her ladies-in-waiting nearly toppled the government. These early years were a baptism by fire, where the Queen learned that her personal feelings often had to be sacrificed for the stability of the crown and the nation. The arrival of her cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, changed everything. Initially hesitant about marriage, Victoria found herself captivated by Albert's intellect and shared sense of duty. Their meeting was not one of romantic whimsy, but of a profound alignment of purpose. Albert brought a Germanic precision and a passion for social reform that would eventually reshape the British monarchy. In the quiet gardens and darkened drawing rooms, their partnership began to take root, forming a union that would produce 9 children and extend the reach of the British royal family across the entire European continent. The wedding of Victoria and Albert in 1840 was a turning point for the monarchy's public image. Breaking with tradition, Victoria wore a dress of white silk and orange blossoms, popularizing the white wedding dress for generations to come. The ceremony was a blend of personal devotion and political theater. As they exchanged vows in the Chapel Royal, the union symbolized a departure from the excesses of the past toward a new era of domestic virtue and middle-class values. Underneath the celebration, however, lay the immense pressure of two people attempting to navigate the complexities of a shared power. Life within the palace walls became a delicate balance of public duty and private family life. Victoria and Albert's household was run with strict discipline, reflecting Albert's desire for efficiency and Victoria's need for order. Despite the pressures of ruling, the Queen was a prolific correspondent and a devoted mother, though her relationship with her children was often complicated by her own demanding nature. In the dimly lit nurseries, the future kings and queens of Europe were raised, unaware that their marriages would soon become the diplomatic threads that held the fragile peace of the 19th century together. As the mid-19th century progressed, Victoria's role as the grandmother of Europe began to take shape. Her children were strategically married into the royal houses of Prussia, Russia, Greece, and beyond. These unions were intended to foster peace and spread British influence, effectively turning the European map into an extended family tree. In her private chambers, Victoria pored over maps and genealogy charts, orchestrating the futures of nations through the lives of her offspring. The legacy of her bloodline was becoming the cornerstone of European diplomacy, a complex web that would eventually face the ultimate test of war. In 1858, the first grand maneuver of Victoria's dynastic project was realized. Her eldest daughter, Victoria, known affectionately as Vicky, was wed to Prince Frederick William of Prussia. This union was not merely a romantic entanglement, but a calculated bridge between the liberal ideals of the British monarchy and the rising military might of the Hohenzollerns. Victoria envisioned a future where her daughter would guide Germany toward a more constitutional path, fostering a lasting Anglo-Prussian alliance. However, as the young bride departed for Berlin, the weight of her mother's expectations hung heavy, a silent passenger on the journey toward a destiny fraught with political peril. The year 1861 brought a shattering blow to the Queen's personal world and her political machinery. Prince Albert, her husband, partner, and the architect of her global strategy, succumbed to illness at the age of 42. Victoria was plunged into a profound, suffocating grief that would define the rest of her life. She retreated from public view, cloistering herself in the gloom of Windsor and Osborne. This period of mourning threatened to destabilize the very empire Albert had helped her build. The Queen's withdrawal into the darkness of her sorrow left the family's vast European network without its primary navigator, as Victoria sought solace in the silent memories of her lost prince. Emerging from the initial paralysis of her grief, Victoria donned the black mourning clothes she would never set aside. She became the widow of Windsor, a spectral figure who ruled from the shadows. Despite her isolation, her influence over her children's lives intensified. She managed their households and their choices through a relentless stream of letters, maintaining a tight grip on the reins of family diplomacy. Her private chambers became a command center, where she monitored the shifting loyalties of European courts. The Queen's mourning was not just a personal choice, but a branding of her reign, serious, stoic, and perpetually anchored in the memory of the past. While Victoria remained in mourning, her eldest son and heir, Albert Edward, the Prince of Wales, pursued a life of leisure and socialite revelry. Known as Bertie, his lifestyle was a source of constant friction with his mother, who found him ill-suited for the weight of kingship. Victoria feared that his lack of discipline would undo the moral foundation she and Albert had laid. Despite her disapproval, Bertie's charisma and social connections across the continent provided a different kind of diplomatic layer, one of soft power and high society influence. This tension between the secluded mother and the visible son created a complex dynamic within the British monarchy's international image. The web of Victoria's influence reached its most treacherous extension in the Russian Empire. Her granddaughter, Alix of Hesse, became the focus of a match with the future Tsar Nicholas II. Victoria was initially hesitant, wary of the instability and the dark rumors of the Romanov court. Yet the marriage proceeded, linking the British royal family to the absolute autocracy of the East. Alix, becoming Tsarina Alexandra, carried with her the British sensibilities of her upbringing into a world of mysticism and impending revolution. This connection promised to harmonize two of the world's greatest empires, but it also planted the seeds of a shared tragedy that would eventually consume them both. As the family tree expanded, a silent, biological shadow began to haunt the royal houses of Europe. Victoria was a carrier of the hemophilia gene, a condition that hindered blood clotting and often proved fatal. This royal malady was passed down to her children and grandchildren, appearing in the royal families of Spain, Germany, and most notably, Russia. The health of heirs became a matter of national security, and the secret of the disease was guarded with fierce desperation. What was intended to be a legacy of strength through blood was now compromised by a hidden fragility, adding a layer of tragic mystery to the grandmother's carefully orchestrated marriages. In 1876, Victoria's title was expanded to include Empress of India, a move orchestrated by Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli to solidify British imperial dominance. This new title elevated her status among the European monarchs, many of whom were her own kin. She became more than just a grandmother. She was a symbolic figurehead for a global empire upon which the sun never set. While she never visited India, she surrounded herself with Indian servants and artifacts, creating a mini Orientalist court at home. This expansion of her identity further complicated the family dynamic, as she now ruled over a vast, diverse population while managing the personal lives of European royalty. The Queen's primary tool for continental control remained the written word. Thousands of letters flowed from her desk every year, addressed to Dear Willie in Germany or Dearest Nicky in Russia. These letters were filled with grandmotherly advice, stern rebukes, and political insights. She acted as a grand mediator, often attempting to de-escalate tensions between her grandsons before they could reach their respective governments. This postal diplomacy was the glue that held the fragile peace of Europe together. Behind the scenes, the Victorian era's greatest strength was this intimate familial network that bypassed official diplomatic channels, all managed by an elderly woman in mourning black. The Golden Jubilee of 1887 served as the ultimate family reunion. Kings, queens, and princes from across Europe, all related to Victoria, descended upon London to celebrate her 50-year reign. The streets were lined with subjects from every corner of the empire, but the real power was concentrated in the banquet halls of Buckingham Palace. Here, the grandmother of Europe sat at the head of a table of world leaders who were her own flesh and blood. It was the pinnacle of her dynastic success. However, beneath the toasts and the finery, subtle rivalries and nationalistic tensions simmered as the younger generation of royals began to assert their own conflicting ambitions. Among the grandchildren, none proved more challenging than Wilhelm II, the future Kaiser of Germany. Born with a withered arm and a volatile temperament, Wilhelm felt a deep sense of insecurity and a desperate need to prove his strength. His relationship with his grandmother was a mix of intense adoration and fierce resentment. He viewed the British influence of his mother, Vicky, as a threat to Prussian honor. As he ascended the throne, his erratic behavior and desire for a massive navy began to strain the familial bonds Victoria had worked so hard to forge. The grandmother of Europe watched with growing concern as her favorite grandson began to challenge the very hegemony she represented. As Wilhelm II ascended the German throne in 1888, the delicate balance of European power began to tilt. The young Kaiser, driven by a complex psychological need to overcompensate for his physical limitations, dismissed the veteran statesman Otto von Bismarck. Victoria watched from across the Channel as her grandson dismantled the cautious diplomacy that had kept the continent at peace. His ambition for Weltpolitik, a desire for global dominance and a navy that could rival Britain's, was a direct challenge to his grandmother's empire. The letters exchanged between Windsor and Berlin grew increasingly strained, filled with veiled warnings and familial rebukes. In the secluded corridors of Windsor Castle, Queen Victoria spent her evenings reading diplomatic dispatches under the flickering glow of candlelight. The reports from Germany were deeply troubling. Wilhelm's erratic behavior and his public outbursts against British influence were more than just personal slights. They were cracks in the foundation of the European peace she had carefully constructed. Her mourning clothes, never discarded since Albert's death, seemed to weigh heavier upon her. She began to realize that the blood ties she had cultivated through her children's marriages might not be enough to hold back the tide of nationalistic fervor. Victoria's attention was also drawn eastward toward the Russian Empire. Her favorite granddaughter, Alex of Hesse, had married Tsar Nicholas II, bringing the British royal bloodline into the heart of the Romanov dynasty. Victoria had initially opposed the union, fearing the instability of the Russian throne and the dark omens surrounding the Romanov family. However, the love between Nicky and Aleki was genuine. This marriage represented Victoria's final great attempt to secure peace through family, placing her granddaughter at the side of one of the world's most powerful autocrats, hoping her influence would steer Russia towards stability. Despite her age and physical frailty, Victoria remained the central hub of a vast intelligence network. Every morning, she pored over letters from her daughters and granddaughters who were now queens and duchesses across Europe. These were not merely family updates. They were detailed reports on political shifts, military movements, and the moods of foreign courts. She was the matriarch of a continental web, using her influence to mediate disputes and temper the egos of her powerful male relatives. Yet, the shadows of the coming century were lengthening, and the web she had spun was becoming increasingly fragile under the weight of modern tensions. The year 1897 marked Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, a spectacular celebration of 60 years on the throne. London was transformed into a theater of imperial power, with soldiers and dignitaries from every corner of the British Empire parading through the streets. Victoria, seated in an open carriage, was moved to tears by the deafening cheers of the crowds. It was a moment of supreme triumph, a public testament to the stability and reach of her reign. Yet, beneath the surface of the festivities, the geopolitical landscape was shifting rapidly. The Jubilee was both a celebration of an era and a poignant farewell to it. Away from the public spectacle, the Jubilee underscored Victoria's increasing isolation. Her closest confidants were gone, and she was now a living relic of a bygone age. She found solace in the presence of her Indian servant, Abdul Karim, whose influence at court caused scandal and resentment among her family and staff. To Victoria, Karim was a bridge to the vast empire she ruled but would never visit. The Munshi provided her with companionship and lessons in Urdu, a small window into the diverse world she had claimed as her own, even as her British advisors plotted to remove him from her side. The turn of the century brought the Boer War, a conflict in South Africa that drained the British treasury and tarnished the empire's reputation. Victoria felt the loss of every soldier personally, spending her days visiting wounded men and writing to the families of the fallen. The war exposed the vulnerabilities of her military and the growing hostility of other European powers, particularly Germany. Wilhelm's public support for the Boers was a bitter betrayal that Victoria could not easily forgive. The stress of the conflict began to take a visible toll on her health, her small frame becoming even more frail as she carried the weight of the war. Communication between the European monarchs had become a game of high-stakes chess. Wilhelm II's Kruger telegram and his increasing naval expansion were clear signals that he no longer respected the old order Victoria represented. The family gatherings that once felt like reunions were now tense diplomatic summits. Victoria tried to maintain the peace, writing stern but motherly letters to Wilhelm, urging him to reconsider his path. But the Kaiser was no longer the boy who had once adored her. He was a monarch determined to forge his own destiny, even if it meant breaking his grandmother's heart and the peace of the world. By 1900, the Queen's health was in steep decline. She retreated to Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, the home she and Albert had built as a private sanctuary. Her eyesight was failing, and her mobility was limited to a wheelchair. Yet, she remained the head of the family, receiving reports and visitors until her final weeks. She watched the sun set over the Solent, perhaps sensing that the long afternoon of her reign was finally coming to an end. The vast empire she had nurtured was at its zenith, but the family she had planted across Europe was beginning to turn against itself. In January 1901, the inevitable arrived. As the Queen lay on her deathbed at Osborne, her family gathered from across Europe. Surprisingly, it was Wilhelm II who rushed to her side, setting aside his political grievances to hold his grandmother's hand in her final hours. The grandmother of Europe passed away peacefully, surrounded by the kings and queens she had created. Her death marked the end of an era that had defined the 19th century. As her coffin was carried through the streets of London, a profound silence fell over the empire. The family ties were still intact, but without Victoria's guiding hand, the world was about to descend into chaos. With the passing of Victoria, the crown passed to her eldest son, Edward VII. Known for his love of leisure and diplomacy, Edward sought to maintain the peace his mother had so carefully curated. However, the atmosphere in London had shifted. The somber, mourning black of the Victorian era slowly gave way to a more opulent, yet anxious Edwardian age. Beneath the surface of garden parties and state visits, a dark undercurrent of geopolitical tension was rising. The king, though skilled in mediation, lacked the grandmotherly authority that had once kept his volatile continental nephews in check. The era of the grandmother was truly over. The funeral of Queen Victoria was the last time the great houses of Europe stood together in genuine, if strained, solidarity. Walking behind the gun carriage were the Kaiser of Germany and the future King of England, mourning a common loss. For a brief moment, the personal bond of family trumped the ambitions of nations. But as the coffin was lowered into the vault at Frogmore, the invisible threads that held the European map together began to fray. The cousins looked at one another not just as family, but as rivals for the first time in their lives. Kaiser Wilhelm II returned to Germany with a heart full of conflicting emotions. He had loved his grandmother, yet he harbored a deep-seated resentment toward the British establishment that he felt had always looked down upon him. He began to envision a Germany that did not need British approval. a Germany with a navy that could challenge the Royal Navy on the high seas. This obsession with naval power became the primary wedge between the cousins. The personal letters between Willie and Georgie grew colder, replaced by the rigid language of admirals and ministers of war. In the East, the shadow of revolution was beginning to touch the Romanovs. Tsar Nicholas II, Victoria's grandson-in-law, and his wife Alexandra, Victoria's favorite granddaughter, retreated into a private world of domesticity and mysticism. Their distance from the people of Russia mirrored their growing distance from their British and German cousins. Alexandra, carrying the hemophilia gene inherited from Victoria, lived in constant fear for her son's life. This secret burden isolated the Russian court, making them vulnerable to internal dissent and external manipulation, further destabilizing the fragile peace Victoria had once balanced so carefully from her desk. As the first decade of the 20th century progressed, Europe became a web of secret treaties and formal alliances. On parchment, the continent was being carved into two opposing camps, the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance. Victoria's grandchildren were no longer just a family. They were the figureheads of opposing war machines. Each state visit and royal wedding became a strategic maneuver. The light of the old world was fading, replaced by the cold, hard logic of industrial warfare and imperial expansion. The family tree was being pruned into a series of jagged spears pointed at one another. The year 1910 saw the death of King Edward VII, and with him, the last vestige of the Victorian diplomatic style. His son, George V, ascended the throne during a time of intense domestic and international turmoil. George was a man of duty, resembling his cousin Tsar Nicholas II so closely they were often mistaken for twins. This physical resemblance was a haunting reminder of their shared bloodline. Yet blood was no longer enough to stop the momentum of the coming storm. The industrial world was moving faster than the monarchies could adapt, and the old order was beginning to crack. In Berlin, the Kaiser felt increasingly encircled. He believed his British and Russian cousins were conspiring to stifle Germany's place in the sun. His rhetoric became more aggressive, and his military advisors gained more influence. The ghost of Victoria seemed to haunt him. He often spoke of her with a mix of reverence and spite. He felt he was the true heir to her imperial spirit, yet he was the one most responsible for dismantling her peaceful legacy. The tragedy of the family feud was that everyone believed they were the ones honoring her memory the most. The spark that finally lit the fuse came from the Balkans, a region Victoria had always feared would be the undoing of Europe. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo triggered a cascade of treaty obligations that no royal intervention could stop. The grandmother of Europe was no longer there to call her grandsons to a summit. The telegrams exchanged between Willie and Nicky in the final days of peace were desperate and heartbreaking. They addressed each other as cousins, pleading for a way out. But the machinery of mobilization had already begun to turn, indifferent to their family ties. As war was declared in August 1914, the irony of the situation was lost on no one. The King of England, the German Emperor, and the Russian Tsar were all first cousins, all grandchildren of Victoria. They were leading their empires into a fratricidal conflict that would destroy the very world she had built. In London, King George V signed the declaration of war with a heavy heart, knowing that he was effectively going to war against his own family. The family portraits that lined the hallways of Buckingham Palace and the Schloss Berlin now looked down upon enemies rather than kin. The Great War became a graveyard for the Victorian dream. On the battlefields of the Somme and Verdun, the sophisticated civilization the Queen had championed was torn apart by machine guns and poison gas. In Russia, the Romanovs faced the ultimate price for their isolation, as the war fueled a revolution that would end their dynasty forever. Victoria's grandchildren were witnessing the violent birth of a new century, one that had no place for the absolute power of kings and queens. The grandmother of Europe had left a legacy of peace, but her descendants had inherited a world of ash and bone. The guns of the Great War finally fell silent in 1918, but the Europe that emerged from the smoke was unrecognizable. The old world, meticulously stitched together by Queen Victoria's strategic marriages, had been torn apart at the seams. In the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, new borders were drawn with the stroke of a pen, disregarding the bloodlines that had once defined nations. The grandmother of Europe now looked down from her portraits upon a continent where three of the great empires ruled by her descendants, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Russia, had utterly collapsed into the dust of history. In London, King George V faced a crisis of identity that threatened the very survival of the House of Windsor. Despite being Victoria's grandson, his family name, Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, carried the heavy, uncomfortable weight of his German heritage during a time of intense anti-German sentiment. To save the monarchy, he took the radical step of stripping away his ancestral titles and rebranding the dynasty. In a candlelit room, the king signed the proclamation that severed his house from its continental roots, choosing Windsor as a shield against the rising tide of republicanism that was sweeping away his cousins. Across the sea, Victoria's eldest grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II, lived out his days in a lonely, bitter exile in the Netherlands. The man who had once dreamed of leading a global empire now spent his mornings chopping wood in the gardens of Huisdoorn. He was a ghost of the Victorian era, haunted by the memories of his grandmother's stern advice and the letters she had written to him in her steady, authoritative hand. His fall was the most dramatic of all, representing the final, violent end of the absolute monarchies Victoria had spent her life trying to preserve and stabilize. The fate of the Romanovs in Russia cast a long, terrifying shadow over every royal palace in Europe. When news of the brutal execution of Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, Victoria's favorite granddaughter, and their 5 children reached London, it sent a shockwave of grief and fear through the British royal family. The Queen's bloodline had been spilled in a cellar in Yekaterinburg, proving that the crown offered no protection against the fury of revolution. The Victorian dream of a safe, interconnected royal elite was dead, replaced by the cold reality of a world that no longer worshipped kings. Deep within the archives of Windsor Castle, the personal diaries of Queen Victoria became more than just historical records. They were the blueprints of a lost age. Scholars and royals alike pored over her thousands of pages, seeking to understand how the world had spiraled so far from her vision of peace. The candlelight flickered over her cramped, frantic handwriting, revealing a woman who had struggled to balance her role as a mother with her duties as an empress. Each page turned was a journey back to a time of certainty, a stark contrast to the chaotic, fractured world of the 1920s. The Victorian era's rigid social structures were crumbling alongside the empires. In the streets of London, women who had been inspired by Victoria's long reign but frustrated by her lack of support for their rights were demanding the vote. The irony was profound. While a woman had sat on the throne for 64 years, the women of Britain were only now breaking free from the domestic spheres Victoria had championed. The monarchy had to adapt or perish. George V began to reach out to the working classes, moving the crown away from the ivory tower of Victoria's secluded widowhood and into the public eye. Victoria's granddaughters who remained on their thrones, like Queen Marie of Romania and Queen Victoria Eugenie of Spain, found themselves navigating treacherous political waters. They were the last outposts of the Victorian order, often acting as diplomats and symbols of stability in nations racked by internal strife. Marie, in particular, used her royal status and Victorian upbringing to champion her country at the peace conferences, proving that the grandmother's influence still had some potency. However, they were queens in an age of rising dictators, their crowns increasingly fragile symbols in a world turning towards steel and propaganda. The physical relics of Victoria's reign, the great monuments, the Jubilee statues, and the sprawling estates, began to feel like tombstones for a civilization that had passed away. In the industrial north of England, the factories that had powered her empire were now struggling, and the coal smoke that once symbolized progress was now seen as a weight upon the nation's spirit. The grand Victorian architecture, once a symbol of indestructible power, now appeared ornate and excessive to a generation that had seen the efficiency of the machine gun and the tank. The aesthetic of the era was being replaced by the sharp lines of modernism. As the 1920s roared into life, the strict Victorian morality that had governed public life for decades began to dissolve. The Jazz Age brought a new sense of freedom and a rejection of the mourning-clad somberness that Victoria had personified for so long. Yet even in this era of rebellion, the image of the Queen remained a powerful touchstone. She was the anchor to a time before the world went mad, a symbol of a lost golden age of order and decency. For many, the memory of Victoria was a comforting ghost in a century that seemed to be moving too fast for anyone to control. Queen Victoria had built a family to rule a continent, but she could not protect them from the relentless tide of history. Her legacy was a complicated tapestry of blood, power, and unintended consequences. She had intended her descendants to be the guardians of peace. Instead, they had been the catalysts for some of the greatest tragedies of the 20th century. As the sun set on the first half of the new century, the grandmother of Europe remained a monumental figure, a matriarch whose shadow was so long it reached across battlefields, through revolutions, and into the very heart of the modern world. As the 19th century drew to a close, Queen Victoria stood as a living bridge between the medieval past and the industrial future. Her empire spanned the globe, but her internal focus remained on the fragile alliances of her own bloodline. The grandmother of Europe watched as the world changed outside her palace walls, sensing the shifting gears of history. Her children and grandchildren occupied the thrones of Germany, Russia, Spain, and beyond, a biological empire meant to ensure a lasting peace. Yet beneath the surface of this regal web, the first cracks of discord were beginning to form, threatening the very stability she had spent decades building. Victoria had masterfully orchestrated the marriages of her descendants, believing that family ties would prevent the outbreak of war. She viewed the map of Europe not as a collection of rival states, but as a family tree where every branch was interconnected. In her private studies, she pored over letters from across the continent, acting as the ultimate arbiter of royal conduct and diplomacy. This was the era of grandmotherly diplomacy, where the peace of nations often hung on the tone of a personal missive sent from Windsor or Balmoral. She was the matriarch of a dynasty that seemed destined to rule forever. Hidden within the royal bloodline was a silent, biological time bomb: hemophilia. Victoria was a carrier of the bleeder's disease, a condition that she unwittingly passed to several of her children and grandchildren. In an age of fragile royal succession, this genetic legacy was a dark secret that haunted the palaces of Europe. A simple bruise could become a life-threatening crisis for the young princes who were meant to inherit the world. This invisible inheritance cast a shadow over the festive royal gatherings, turning every celebration into a moment of whispered anxiety. The health of the heirs became a matter of national security, and profound personal tragedy. The annual gatherings at Balmoral were a spectacle of dynastic unity, where the future kings and emperors played together as children. Among them were the cousins, George of Britain, Wilhelm of Germany, and Nicholas of Russia. To Victoria, they were simply Georgie, Willie, and Nicky. She watched them with a mix of pride and apprehension, hoping that their shared childhood memories would outweigh their future national interests. But even in play, the differences in their temperaments were evident. The seeds of the Great War were being sown in the very nurseries and hunting grounds of the British countryside, under the watchful eye of their grandmother. Of all her grandchildren, Wilhelm of Germany was perhaps the most complex. Born with a withered arm and a desperate need for his grandmother's approval, he swung between deep affection for England and a burning desire to surpass its power. Victoria saw the volatility in him, a restless energy that threatened the delicate balance of her European peace. Wilhelm's relationship with his grandmama was a mixture of reverence and resentment. He sought to build a navy that could rival hers, viewing the British Empire as both a model to emulate and an obstacle to be overcome. The shadows in the German court were growing longer. In Russia, Victoria's favorite granddaughter, Alex, had become Empress Alexandra Feodorovna. Her marriage to Tsar Nicholas II was a union of deep love but tragic consequences. Alex had carried the hemophilia gene into the heart of the Romanov dynasty, a fact that would lead them to seek the counsel of the mystic Rasputin. Victoria's letters to Alex were filled with grandmotherly advice, yet she could not protect her from the rising tide of revolution and the internal decay of the Russian Empire. The grandmother of Europe watched from afar as the most stable-looking throne in the East began to tremble under the weight of its own secrets. The spread of the royal disease reached even the sun-drenched court of Spain through Victoria's granddaughter, Victoria Eugenie. What was meant to be a marriage of state and a symbol of British influence in the Mediterranean became a source of ongoing tragedy. Each birth in the Spanish royal family was met with agonizing suspense. Would the heir be a bleeder? This genetic legacy strained the marriage and the monarchy, contributing to the instability of the Spanish throne. Victoria's biological influence was proving to be a double-edged sword, binding the nations together in shared suffering, rather than the peaceful coexistence she had envisioned for her descendants. In 1897, the Diamond Jubilee celebrated Victoria's 60 years on the throne, a moment of unparalleled imperial splendor. London was the center of the world, and Victoria was its undisputed sun. Yet even during the height of the festivities, the Queen felt the weight of her years and the losses she had endured. Most of her original advisors and her beloved Albert were long gone. She was a monument in black, a silent observer of the empire she had helped define. The Jubilee was not just a celebration of the past, but a nervous look toward a future where the British Empire would no longer stand alone. By January 1901, the Victorian era was finally reaching its end at Osborne House. The Queen's health failed rapidly, and her family gathered from across the continent to bid her farewell. Her grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm, rushed to her bedside, holding her in his arms as she breathed her last. Her death marked the true end of the 19th century. As the news spread, a profound silence fell over the world. The matriarch who had governed the hearts and politics of Europe for over 6 decades was gone, leaving behind a family that would soon turn on itself without her stabilizing presence to guide them. The funeral of Queen Victoria was a gathering of kings and emperors that the world would never see again. They rode through the streets of London in a somber procession, a sea of black and white against the winter fog. To the public, it was a display of unparalleled royal unity. But for those within the circle, The loss of the grandmother meant the removal of the final barrier to war. Without her personal authority and the respect she commanded, the rivalries between her grandsons would soon boil over. The peace she had sought to build through blood and marriage was as fragile as the glass in a palace window. With Victoria's body finally laid to rest at Frogmore beside her beloved Albert, the iron grip she held over her sprawling family began to loosen almost immediately. Kaiser Wilhelm II, her eldest grandson, returned to Berlin with a heavy heart. Yet his grief was intertwined with a growing, restless ambition. He had always felt slighted by his British relatives, and without his grandmother's moderating presence, his desire to see Germany surpass Britain's naval might become an obsession. The personal bonds that had once linked the palaces of London and Berlin were now fraying, replaced by a cold, calculated pursuit of imperial dominance. In the East, Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra returned to a Russia simmering with internal unrest. Alexandra, Victoria's favorite granddaughter, felt the loss of her grandmother's counsel as a devastating blow. Without the grandmother of Europe to act as a bridge between the Romanovs and the Windsors, the diplomatic distance between the two empires began to widen. Nicholas, though a man of peace, found himself trapped by the rigid protocols of his autocracy and the aggressive expansionism of his generals. The family letters that once carried news of children and health were now increasingly filled with formal, strained political grievances. King Edward VII, now ruling at last, sought to maintain the peace his mother had cherished, but his style was vastly different. Where Victoria had ruled through moral authority and matriarchal duty, Edward relied on personal charm and continental diplomacy. He forged the Entente Cordiale with France, a move that deeply offended his nephew, Wilhelm. The Kaiser saw this as a personal betrayal and a deliberate attempt to encircle Germany. The family tree, once a network of peace, was transforming into a map of strategic alliances. The informal Republic of Kings was being replaced by a hard-edged world of secret treaties and military pacts. The famous Willy-Nicky telegrams began to flow between Berlin and St. Petersburg, a desperate and often bizarre attempt by the royal cousins to bypass their own governments. In these private messages, they addressed each other as brothers, trying to use their personal relationship to settle international disputes. However, the weight of their respective empires was too great. The personal affection they held for one another, nurtured at Victoria's tea tables and garden parties, was no longer enough to stop the momentum of the industrial war machines they commanded. The tragedy of the family was that they were becoming prisoners of their own titles. As the naval arms race intensified, the shared summers at Cowes and the family gatherings at Osborne House became distant memories. Every new battleship launched by Germany was seen as a direct threat to the British crown. Wilhelm, despite his genuine love for his British grandmother, could not resist the urge to challenge the naval supremacy she had personified. This rivalry was personal. It was the rebellion of a grandson against the shadow of his powerful elders. The sea that once connected the royal families was now a battlefield in waiting, where steel and coal replaced the grace of royal yachts. In the archives of the various royal houses, the burning of private correspondence became a common practice. Many of Victoria's descendants, sensing the coming storm, sought to hide the intimate and often conflicting advice she had given them. They wanted to present a unified front to their people, even as they plotted against their own kin. The grandmother's letters, once the glue of European stability, were being fed into fireplaces. The warmth they once provided was replaced by the heat of burning secrets. The history of the grandmother of Europe was being systematically edited to suit the needs of rising nationalism. The Balkans soon emerged as the spark that the royal family could not extinguish. Despite the intricate web of marriages Victoria had woven into the minor thrones of Eastern Europe, nationalist fervor proved stronger than blood. The royal cousins found themselves powerless to stop the regional conflicts from dragging their empires into a broader confrontation. The grandmother's influence had been moral and personal, but the world was now governed by the cold logic of mobilization schedules and railway timetables. The ancient British royal mystery of how a single family could rule a continent was reaching its final, tragic chapter. In London, the unveiling of the massive Victoria Memorial in front of Buckingham Palace served as a grand, marble tribute to a vanished era. King Edward VII and his nephew Wilhelm II stood side by side for the ceremony, the last time they would ever see each other. To the cheering crowds, they were still the symbols of a stable world order. But beneath the medals and the plumes, the tension was palpable. The statue of Victoria, serene and eternal, looked out over a city that was already arming for a conflict that would tear her family and her legacy to pieces. Behind closed doors, the royal advisors were no longer talking about family reunions. They were talking about war. In secret rooms lit by flickering candles, the family trees were being compared to strategic battle maps. The very marriages that Victoria had intended as instruments of peace were now being scrutinized for weaknesses. A princess in one court was now a potential spy for another. The trust that had defined the Victorian era had evaporated, replaced by a dark suspicion that even blood ties could not bridge. The palace walls, once a sanctuary of family life, were now cold and silent. By the summer of 1914, the legacy of the grandmother of Europe was hanging by a single, fraying thread. The assassination in Sarajevo was the final blow that the royal network could not survive. The cousins who had played together as children in the halls of Windsor and Balmoral now found themselves at the heads of armies destined to destroy one another. The portrait of the great family, once so proud and unified, was now metaphorically cracked down the middle. As the lamps went out all over Europe, the era of Victoria finally ended, not with her death, but with the roar of the guns. In the frantic final days of peace, the telegram wires between London, Berlin, and St. Petersburg hummed with a desperate, intimate dialogue. These were the Willy-Nicky telegrams, a series of personal pleas exchanged between Kaiser Wilhelm II and Tsar Nicholas II. They addressed each other as cousins, as family, trying to halt the machinery of mobilization that their own generals had set in motion. Yet, the weight of their empires and the rigid alliances they had built proved heavier than their shared blood. The grandmother's dream of a peaceful, united Europe was being crushed by the very systems designed to protect it. As war was officially declared, King George V of Great Britain found himself in an agonizing position. He was the head of a nation at war with his own first cousin, Wilhelm. The shared heritage of the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, which Victoria had so carefully cultivated to bridge the gap between Britain and Germany, was now a liability. In the quiet corridors of Buckingham Palace, the king paced, surrounded by portraits of his German ancestors. The faces that once represented stability now felt like ghosts of a betrayal, their eyes watching him through the thick, oppressive gloom of a world falling apart. The conflict tore through the royal family tree like a forest fire. Victoria's granddaughters, who had married into the ruling houses of Europe, were now enemies. Empress Alexandra of Russia, born Alex of Hesse and Victoria's favorite, watched her adopted country spiral into chaos while fighting her native Germany. The letters they once exchanged, filled with news of children and garden parties, were replaced by silence or censored reports of slaughter. The intimate web of the grandmother of Europe had become a net of thorns, trapping her descendants in a tragedy of their own making, where every victory felt like a fratricide. In Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm II maintained a facade of military brilliance, yet he was haunted by his grandmother's memory. He had been present at her deathbed, holding her in his arms as she breathed her last. He had always craved the respect of the British side of his family, but his ambition and insecurity had led him to challenge their naval supremacy. Now, the British press vilified him as a monster. The man who had once proudly worn the uniform of a British admiral was now the architect of its potential destruction, his royal legacy dissolving into the mud of the Western Front. By 1917, the strain on the monarchies reached a breaking point. In Britain, anti-German sentiment was so fierce that King George V took a radical step to save his throne. He issued a royal proclamation stripping away all German titles and house names. The House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha was renamed the House of Windsor. With a stroke of a pen, the king severed the formal ties to his grandmother's beloved Prince Albert. It was a symbolic burial of Victoria's vision. The German roots of the British monarchy were being surgically removed to ensure the crown's survival in a changing world. While George V secured his line, his cousin Nicholas II faced a far darker fate. The Russian Revolution, fueled by the disasters of the war, swept the Romanovs from power. Nicholas, Alexandra, and their children, Victoria's great-grandchildren, were held in captivity. In their isolation, they clung to the Victorian values of family and faith that the Queen had instilled in them, but the world Victoria had known was dead. The ancient mystery of royal divine right was being dismantled by the cold, hard steel of the Bolsheviks. The Romanov branch of the family tree was about to be violently severed forever. The news of the Romanovs' execution sent shockwaves through the remaining royal houses. King George V, who had initially considered offering them asylum but withdrew it for political reasons, was devastated by the loss of his cousin Nicky. The war had not only redrawn maps, but had also fundamentally changed the nature of kingship. The Victorian era's belief in the permanence of dynasties was shattered. As the guns finally fell silent in November 1918, the survivors looked out over a landscape of ruined empires. The grandmother of Europe's descendants were either in exile, dead, or reigning over diminished, weary nations. In the aftermath, Kaiser Wilhelm II fled to the Netherlands, living out his days in exile. He spent his time chopping wood and reflecting on the empire he had lost. He remained obsessed with his grandmother, Queen Victoria, often speaking of her with a mix of reverence and resentment. He believed that had she lived, the war would never have happened, that the grandmother of Europe would have knocked their heads together and settled the dispute in the drawing room. But Victoria was a figure of the 19th century, and the 20th century had no room for her brand of family-led diplomacy. The legacy of Queen Victoria did not vanish with the war, but it was irrevocably altered. The interconnectedness she had championed became a cautionary tale of how personal ties can draw entire nations into local conflicts. Yet, her bloodline remained. Even as empires fell, her descendants continued to occupy the remaining thrones of Europe, in the United Kingdom, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Spain, and Greece. They were no longer the absolute masters of the world, but rather symbols of continuity in a fractured age. The grandmother of Europe had left a genetic map that survived the very maps she helped to draw. As the dust of the Great War settled, the image of Queen Victoria transitioned from a living matriarch to a mythic figure of a lost golden age. She became the symbol of a time when the world seemed more orderly, even if that order was built on the backs of millions. Her influence lived on in the rituals of state and the private memories of her grieving descendants. The story of the grandmother of Europe remains a haunting testament to the power of family and the tragic limitations of that power when faced with the relentless march of modern history. In the decades following the Great War, the statues of Queen Victoria across London became silent, stone observers of a world she would no longer recognize. Her image, once a symbol of living authority, hardened into an immutable icon of the past. As the fog rolled off the Thames, the heavy bronze and marble monuments stood as anchors to an era of perceived stability. Yet, beneath this stillness, the complexities of her reign began to be scrutinized by a new generation. The grandmother of Europe was now a monumental ghost, her stern gaze fixed forever on the horizon of an empire that was slowly beginning to fracture under the weight of its own history. In the archives of Windsor, the vast paper trail of Victoria's life remained. Thousands of letters, journals, and sketches that chronicled her private heart. Historians, working by the dim light of modern lamps, began to peel back the layers of the myth. They found a woman of intense passion, deep insecurities, and a stubborn will that had shaped the destinies of nations. These documents served as a bridge between the regal facade and the human reality. Every inkstroke on the yellowing parchment revealed the intimate thoughts of a woman who had tried to manage the world as if it were her own drawing room, oblivious to the coming storm. The biological legacy of Victoria, once intended to bind Europe in peace, became a source of tragic reflection. The royal disease, hemophilia, had traveled through her daughters into the veins of the Russian, Spanish, and German dynasties. In the post-war era, scientists and biographers mapped this genetic trail, seeing it as a metaphor for the fragility of the old order. What was meant to be a bloodline of strength had inadvertently introduced a vulnerability that contributed to the collapse of empires. The grandmother's gift was a double-edged sword, a hidden flaw etched into the very DNA of European royalty, whispered about in the dark corners of palaces. Victoria's long widowhood had defined the Victorian era's relationship with grief, turning mourning into a complex cultural ritual. Even long after her death, the image of the Queen in her black weeds persisted as the ultimate symbol of devotion and loss. The dark, somber aesthetics of her later years influenced how the world remembered the 19th century, a time of rigid decorum and public sorrow. In the quiet hallways of her former residences, the heavy black drapes and mementos of Prince Albert remained, frozen in time. She had made a cult of memory, ensuring that the past was never truly buried, but lived on as a shadow over the present. As the 1920s roared on, the contrast between the Jazz Age and the Victorian shadow grew starker. While the youth embraced speed and change, the spirit of Victoria lingered in the institutional halls of the British government. Her influence was felt in the slow-moving rituals of Parliament and the traditionalist mindset of the elder statesman. She was the ghost in the machine of state, a reminder of a time when British power was unquestioned. The tension between the new modern world and the old Victorian morality created a cultural friction that defined the interwar years. The Queen remained the silent judge of a world that was moving too fast for her liking. The reach of the grandmother of Europe extended far beyond the borders of the continent, leaving a complicated mark on the colonies of the British Empire. To some, she was the benevolent Great Mother, whose image was printed on stamps and currency. To others, she represented the face of a distant and often oppressive power. As independence movements began to stir in India and Africa, the iconography of Victoria became a focal point for debate. Her reign had overseen the zenith of imperial expansion, and her legacy was inextricably tied to the triumphs and the tragedies of colonial rule. The shadow of the crown was long and cast across many lands. Technology began to transform the way the public interacted with the memory of the Queen. The advent of early documentary film and the mass reproduction of photographs allowed the world to see her not just as a statue, but as a person who moved and breathed. However, these flickering, grainy images only added to the sense of mystery. They captured a woman from a vanished world, a monarch who had seen the invention of the telephone but still wrote by candlelight. The juxtaposition of her ancient royal dignity with the mechanical eye of the camera created a haunting portrait of a leader caught between two vastly different centuries. By the late 1930s, the remnants of Victoria's family were scattered across a continent once again on the brink of disaster. The cousins who had played together in the nurseries of Windsor and Potsdam were now heads of state or exiles in a fractured Europe. The personal letters they exchanged reflected a desperate attempt to maintain familial bonds as political ideologies tore their nations apart. Victoria's dream of a pan-European peace through marriage was finally, and irrevocably, proven to be a fantasy. The family tree was being pruned by the harsh realities of modern warfare and the rise of totalitarianism, leaving the legacy of the grandmother in tatters. The cult of Victoria began to evolve into a subject of psychological study and literary reimagining. Writers and thinkers looked back at her era not just with nostalgia, but with a desire to understand the repression and the resilience that defined it. She became a character in the grand narrative of the human experience, a woman who held the world in her hands while struggling with her own private demons. This shift from historical figure to cultural archetype ensured that her influence would survive the decline of the empire. Victoria was no longer just a queen. She was a mirror in which the 20th century viewed its own complex origins. As the world approached the mid-20th century, the Victorian age finally transitioned from living memory into the realm of ancient history. The children who had seen her Diamond Jubilee were now the elders of a new atomic age. Yet, the core of British identity remained inextricably linked to the small woman who had sat on the throne for 63 years. Her funeral had marked the end of an era, but her shadow continued to define the shape of the monarchy. As the sun set on the old world, the image of Victoria remained, a dark, regal silhouette against the light of a changing horizon, a testament to an era that had fundamentally reshaped the globe. In the quiet, dust-filled corridors of the Royal Archives at Windsor, the personal legacy of Victoria is preserved in miles of parchment. For decades, historians have sifted through her thousands of letters and journals, uncovering the private vulnerabilities of a woman who held the world in her hand. These documents reveal a complexity often masked by her public stoicism, her fears, her profound grief, and her sharp political instincts. As the ink fades on the yellowing pages, the mystery of the woman behind the crown only deepens, leaving a trail of questions that continue to fascinate scholars of the modern age. The map of Europe, once a tapestry of Victoria's own bloodline, underwent violent transformations during the World Wars. Her grandchildren, positioned on opposing sides of global conflicts, saw their empires crumble or reform into modern states. The grandmother of Europe had intended her family ties to be a web of peace, yet the forces of nationalism proved stronger than the bonds of kinship. Even as the old thrones fell, the genetic and cultural mark she left upon the European aristocracy remained an indelible footprint of the 19th century order that refused to be entirely erased by time. Across the vast stretches of the former Commonwealth, stone likenesses of the Queen Empress stand as weathered sentinels of a bygone era. From the bustling squares of Mumbai to the parks of Ottawa, these statues have witnessed the rise of independence movements and the birth of new nations. Some have been moved to museums, Others remain as silent witnesses to the complex history of British expansion. They are no longer mere monuments of power, but artifacts of a global shift, their marble features worn smooth by the winds of change and the inevitable passage of centuries. The Victorian era's influence persisted most strongly in the moral and social codes that defined the British middle class for generations. Even as the 1960s brought a revolution in culture and social mores, the echo of Victoria's stern sense of duty and propriety lingered in the architecture of suburban London and the rituals of the civil service. The duality of her reign, the progress of the Industrial Revolution coupled with a rigid social hierarchy, became the foundation upon which the modern British state was built, a structure that modern citizens still navigate, whether they realize it or not. In the modern halls of power, the image of Queen Victoria remains a constant, silent observer. Her portraits hang in the palaces and parliamentary buildings of the United Kingdom, serving as a reminder of the weight of the crown. Every modern monarch who has followed her has lived in the long shadow of her 63-year reign. They inherit not just a title, but the standard she set for personal sacrifice and public service. Her stoic gaze, captured by the great painters of her time, continues to challenge her successors to maintain the dignity of the institution. The transition from the Victorian age to the information age did not diminish her iconic status. Victoria's face, once the most widely reproduced image in the world through the medium of postage stamps and currency, became a symbol of a lost stability. As the world moved faster, her image represented a slower, more deliberate epoch. Collectors and historians treat her era as a peak of British global influence, a time when the sun truly never set on an empire that, for better or worse, unified a significant portion of the globe under one sovereign's name. While Victoria was a figure of the past, her impact on modern medicine and science was profound. The Victorian obsession with classification and exploration laid the groundwork for contemporary biological and geographic understanding. Her patronage of the Great Exhibition showcased a world on the brink of technological explosion. Today, the museums and institutions she helped found stand as monuments to human curiosity. Her reign was the bridge between the medieval and the modern, a period of intense intellectual ferment that defined the scientific landscape for the next 100 years and beyond. The personal life of Victoria, once shrouded in the black veils of her widowhood, has been re-examined through a more compassionate lens in the 21st century. No longer seen just as the widow of Windsor, she is recognized as a woman of intense passion and resilience. Her relationships with her servants, her confidants, and her children are now understood as the struggles of a woman trapped between her personal desires and the immense requirements of her station. This humanization has ensured that her story remains relevant to a modern audience that values authenticity over artifice. As the sun finally sets on the memory of those who lived under her rule, the Victorian age becomes a legend, a mythic time of steam, steel, and empire. The physical world she built is slowly being replaced, yet the foundations remain. The railway lines she opened, the bridges she crossed, and the laws she signed form the skeleton of the modern United Kingdom. She is the ghost in the machine of the British state, a presence that is felt in every opening of Parliament and every royal proclamation, an enduring symbol of national identity. Ultimately, Queen Victoria remains the grandmother of Europe, not just by blood, but by the sheer force of her historical legacy. She was the anchor of a century that changed the human experience forever. As we look back from the vantage point of the present, her silhouette stands tall against the horizon of history, a small woman who cast a shadow across continents. Her story is the story of the modern world's birth, a dark, majestic, and complex tale of a queen who became an era, and an era that became our history.